Burning here.
In Kiev, Dnipro.
Poland.
This is CNN.
Aaron Burnett out front on CNN.
Hello everyone and welcome to Amanpour, live from the Ukrainian capital. Here's what's coming up.
Reporting from Kiev, is Putin's war on Ukraine entering a new phase after a month of setbacks? Tonight we'll ask a top aide to President Zelensky, Igor Zhovkva, and Ilya Ponomarev joins me. He once served in the Russian parliament but opposed Putin's invasions. Now he's here fighting against him for Ukraine. Plus,
if Russia sees this, I want them to know that they aren't defending us. They are killing us.
escape from hell. Ukrainian families forced to flee the besieged city of Mariupol share their stories of loss and survival. Also ahead,
Vladimir Putin obviously is pretty paranoid that the United States is out to get him. He's been convinced for years, in fact, that we've had him in our crosshairs.
former national security official and Russia expert Fiona Hill talks to Walter Isaacson about whether America's strategy to defeat Putin is working.
Welcome to the program, everyone. I'm Christiana Manpour in Kiev, the Ukrainian capital. This nation is certainly battered and it's bloodied, but it is unbowed. It has battled back against Vladimir Putin's unprovoked war for more than a month now. With its fierce resistance, it's dashed Moscow's hopes of a quick victory. So is the Kremlin strategy changing? Here's the recent assessment from a top Russian general, Sergei Rudskoy.
In general, the main tasks of the first stage of the operation have been completed. The combat potential of the armed forces of Ukraine has been significantly reduced, allowing us, I emphasize again, to focus the main efforts on achieving the main goal, the liberation of Donbas.
Rudskoy claimed the Kremlin never ever planned to storm places like Kiev or Kharkiv. But a Ukrainian defense official said today that Russian forces are in fact trying to cut off supply routes to the capital as fighting continues in its suburbs. So what is Putin's aim? It is clear his war is having a devastating impact on civilians. The mayor of Mariupol said today, "We are in the hands of the occupiers," as he called for a complete evacuation of the port city following weeks of a brutal Russian siege. It is unknown just how many civilians have been killed, but hundreds of thousands have been forced to leave everything behind. Some of them are now in Zaporizhia, and they spoke to correspondent Ivan Watson.
Shattered by Russian artillery, the windshield of a car that a Ukrainian family used to make their two-day escape from the besieged port city of Mariupol. We meet Natalia shortly after her family reaches relative safety in the parking lot of a superstore on the edge of the Ukrainian city of Zaporizhia. The day before yesterday, an artillery shell hit our house, she says. Half of the house is gone. This is what was left.
If Russia sees this, I want them to know that they aren't defending us. They are killing us because they seem to think they're defending us, and that's just not true.
This parking lot, an unofficial gateway to Ukrainian-controlled territory for more than 70,000 Ukrainians who officials say fled Mariupol. The evacuees look shell-shocked. They arrive in vehicles draped with white rags and signs that say children, and some, like 4-year-old Alisa Isayeva, show up in yellow school buses. They were bombing us, she says. Bombing us with planes and tanks. Alisa's aunt Lilia says she suffered from a concussion for days after a strike hit her home.
We walked among corpses. There were bodies under the evergreens, soldiers without heads, without arms. They are lying there. Nobody is gathering them. There was such fear that I felt like I was underwater. I wanted to wake up. And now I'm here, and this feels like some kind of a dream.
Inside the superstore, volunteers and the city government are trying to help. Newly arrived evacuees are welcomed at this support center where they're offered warm meals, access to medics, and information about how to travel deeper into safer parts of Ukrainian territory. There's also a bulletin board here where some people are offering free repair of shattered car windows. And there are also postings here looking for information about missing loved ones. For some who survived Russia's modern-day siege, this is the first hint of safety they've had in weeks. Outside, Yulia Mishodova and her son Stanislav have just arrived.
And bear!
Stanislav is chatty and upbeat, but his mother appears unsteady. When Russian warplanes bombed, she says, the family hid under the dining room table, surrounded by pillows.
When the plane flew past, we were sheltering in the center of town. Until now, my ear still hurts from the shockwave.
The unlikely safe haven provided in this parking lot is precarious. Ukrainian officials say Russian troops are positioned barely a half-hour's drive away from here.
Ivan Watson reporting on what is such an extraordinarily suffering situation for people. Now, as Putin's war lurches on, President Zelensky has told a group of independent Russian journalists that Ukraine is ready to accept a neutral status as part of a peace deal with Moscow. Here's what he said.
Security guarantees and our neutrality, the non-nuclear status of our state. We are ready to pursue this. This is the most important point. This was the first point of principle for the Russian Federation, as I recall. And as far as I remember, they started the war because of this.
Zelensky added that any agreement would have to be put to the Ukrainian people in a referendum. Now, my first guest is fighting this war right alongside the Ukrainian people. That's despite being a former member of the Russian parliament. But Ilya Ponomarev was the only Russian politician to vote against the annexation of Crimea back in 2014. And so he is in Kiev, and he's joining me now. Welcome back to the program. We talked to you all those years back when you voted against Putin's invasion back in 2014. Tell me what you're doing right now. How did you manage to join the Ukrainian forces?
Oh, you remember at that time, you asked me, why did I do what I have done? And I said that it means war between Russia and Ukraine. And as you see now, unfortunately, I was right. And at that time, I said that if this war would start, I would fight for peace, and that's what I am doing.
That is extraordinary. So you believed all those years ago that Crimea and those parts of the Donbass region were not the end for Putin, that he would go further?
Absolutely. I didn't believe that he would start the war this February. I would be very frank. I many times repeatedly said that he would first take over Belarus and only then would go into Ukraine. But he has made the suicidal step. That's very irrational step for himself, probably because he was very ill-informed about the real mood of Ukrainian people. And now we see what we see, thousands and thousands of deaths. And deaths among Ukrainian civilians and Russian soldiers.
Can you tell me, Ilya, what you see when you are anywhere near the battlefront in terms of the casualties? Because obviously all sides are giving different numbers. And it's interesting to know what's happening to the Russians if you're able to see that. Do you have any good information, at least from your area where you're fighting, on what the kind of casualties on the opposite side are?
Well, my observation is that each Ukrainian soldier takes at least 4 lives of Russian soldiers. That's more or less the ratio. But unfortunately, the same number of civilians die at the same time. So as many Russians are dying, as many Ukrainian civilians. And that is horrible. And that's very much because of the situation in the Ukrainian skies, because there is no fly zone, and that what kills people every day.
And Ilya, we are obviously in Kiev, and there's there's all sorts of different descriptions about what this battlefield, this urban battlefield, looks like. You know, is it stalled? Are we in a state of a stalemate around the capital? Do you believe that the Russians still want to encircle the capital? Or what can you see again from your analysis?
I think that they will try to encircle the capital. Right now, they have been pushed back in the western and northwestern direction. They're pretty much stopped on the eastern and northeastern direction. I think that despite being pushed back in the west, they would most likely try to advance to the south and to encircle Kiev on the right bank of Dnipro River. But I think that very unlikely that they would succeed. They are trying to provoke a humanitarian catastrophe in Kiev to the same magnitude like they were doing in Mariupol. But in Mariupol, they physically exterminated the city because the city is smaller and very much linked to the sea. Kiev is a very large city, so it's very hard to bomb and to shell it all together, but it's possible to cut off the food supplies, to poison the water, to cut off electricity and natural gas, the heating of the city. And I'm very much afraid that that is the actual objective of Russian troops at this very moment.
So what do you make of the Russian general from the Ministry of Defense, in Moscow, Sergei Rudskoy, who basically over the weekend laid out what looked like a change of plans? Do you see it as a change of plans, or do you take him at face value, that we've done what we intended to do, we have weakened and, more demilitarized the enemy, i.e. the Ukrainians, and now we're really going to just concentrate on what we really want, which is all of the Donbass region?
Well, obviously, they're losing the war. That's for sure. And there is no way how the war can be won by Russia. So it's only a question of where they can settle. And their only hope is to try to save face by saying that they didn't want to capture Kiev, for example, which is not true. That was their initial plan, and we know this for sure. That they didn't plan to capture Odessa or Kharkiv, which is not true. But that they wanted just to extend the territory of so-called People Republics in the east of Ukraine in Donbass. And here very much is dependent, we are very much dependent on the position of international community. If Ukraine would be synchronously pushed into the ceasefire both by Kremlin and by Washington, they may try to create a new set of so-called Minsk agreements and to capture the territory and to keep this territory for an indefinite period of time. But the spirit in the Ukrainians right now is that we need to prevail, we need to win this war, and that we have all the capabilities to win this war. It's now a matter of price, and this price is very much dependent on you guys, whether you would help us to eliminate the jet fighters, the bombers, and the missiles in the skies, or we will do it ourselves.
Ilya, what about? I mean, it is odd that a Russian, not just a Russian parliamentary member would come over here in the. I mean, I know you've been living here for a while, but how did you get the Ukrainian military to accept you in their ranks? And are there any other Russians that you know of anywhere around where you are fighting as well, for this side, Ukraine?
Not where I am, but in general, there are numerous Russians in Ukraine fighting. There were numerous Russians who were coming to join Ukrainian military and volunteer groups back in 2014. I believe there are several thousand of them. There is one regiment which I know next to Kiev, which is fighting on the Ukrainian side against the invaders. But the question is very simple. We think that the key to freedom in Russia right now is in Ukraine. If we are victorious here, if we will defeat Putin here, we will win Russia. That's very much like German anti-fascists were doing back in World War II. You know that the Chancellor Willy Brandt, for example, the leader of German Social Democrats, he was fighting within the Allied armies in Norway against German fascists. And that's not because he was anti-German, and I am not anti-Russian. I am pro-Russian. But I am anti-Putin, and we will kill the bastard.
Well, you have written recently that you don't think he'll be, quote unquote, on this planet in another year. But it is fascinating what you say, because you're fighting for your own country, to liberate your own country via Ukraine. That's obviously the one thing that Putin really fears. One of the reasons many Russians and other analysts say that he just doesn't want Ukraine to be free and democratic and independent is because then ordinary Russians will start asking why it's not okay for them also to be free and democratic. Do you get that sense? Is that where we are in your country, in Russia?
I think so. Ukraine is very much the Achilles tendon for Mr. Putin, and his propaganda all the way down, he was portraying Ukraine as a failed state, because he was saying, you see, Ukrainians have made their revolution and they are failing. And you shouldn't do the revolution here in Russia because you will fail as Ukrainians did. But we are not failing. We are developing here. The country is very actively moving forward. Without that war, we will be moving forward way more rapidly than it was before. Ukraine has all the rights to change their leadership. We had the previous president, now we have a new president because we wanted to change, we wanted new set of reforms, we wanted new direction of the development, and we have done this. If you would travel across the country, you would see how well the infrastructure in Ukraine has developed during the 2 years of President Zelensky, for example. And now these Russian soldiers, which are coming with their tanks into the streets of Ukrainian villages, they're saying, wow, guys, you have asphalt here. We don't have that much in Russia. You live well.
Wow. I mean, we've heard so many stories about some of these Russians, and a lot of them conscripts, you know, basically turning around and leaving or trying to get help from local Ukrainians because their supplies and things have run out. President Zelensky took quite an extraordinary step of giving an interview over the weekend to 4 independent Russian journalists. And he spoke in Russian. Clearly, he was trying to appeal or get his message across to the whole country. But he also said several things, that he would accept a neutral, non-nuclear status. He said that's clearly what Putin wanted in the beginning. It should be the basis of a peace deal. Of course, he added that it would go to a referendum. We were talking a little bit earlier about the aims. Do you think that's enough for Putin? I mean, you know, if you were sort of not doing so well on the battlefield, and your general has said you're going to switch tactics a little bit, and the rival president has said, well, we're ready to become, you know, neutral and non-NATO for the moment. As a politician, which you were, do you see this as any basis for a peace deal?
You know, all these stories about NATO and all these kind of things is a piece of crap. Because if you would look at the map, you would see that there are plenty of points within NATO which are in the closest proximity to St. Petersburg and Moscow. And it absolutely doesn't matter whether in NATO's naval base would be in Crimea, as he was saying this in 2014, or even in Kharkiv, which he was claiming recently. It really doesn't matter. It changes nothing in terms of the military situation and military threat for Kremlin. Political situation, that's what matters. Politically, Putin needs to restore USSR, but not Soviet and neither Soviet nor socialist. He wants to create a union of sovereign Slavic republics and restore the Russian Empire and control all of this territory. and that would include Belarus and Ukraine and maybe Transnistria. I don't know what is in his head. But it's not a military situation at all. And I think that what he wanted with Ukraine when he started this war is he wanted to dismember Ukraine. He wanted to put his marionette government in Kiev, assassinate Zelensky, put a marionette government in Kiev, and then let, say, Poland and Hungary to take over as their protectorate the 8 western regions of Ukraine, so to say, to share the guilt. And I think that was his original plan, but obviously it failed.
And finally, you know, President Zelensky obviously wanted to get this message and this long interview to the Russians. The Russian, you know, the censorship, military censorship has banned it. They won't allow it to be published. It has been published outside, but not inside. You've also talked about, you know, fighting a war on the ground and an information war. Do you think Zelensky's message is getting through to Russia? Are you trying to get messages through to ordinary Russian people? Where do you think they are thinking, or what do you think they're thinking, you know, a month into this war?
Well, you know, we with my friends, besides doing some military fighting here, we created a dedicated media channel called Утро февраля in Russian, which is February's morning. February because the war has started in February, and February because February Revolution of 1917 in February, which ended the imperialist World War I for Russia. And we are using it to talk to ordinary Russians. And a lot of Russians are actually watching it. And we are trying to communicate. It's not enough. By far, it's not enough, unfortunately. But that's as much as we can do. Russian Federation, Kremlin now blocks all the independent media outlets inside the country, and we are right now the only Russian-speaking media which works from Ukraine, from the battlefield, and which can communicate the truth to Russians.
Ilya Ponomarev, thank you so much indeed for joining us. Now, President Biden's off-the-cuff comments in Warsaw over the weekend were not a call for Russian regime change, says the White House. Fiona Hill is a former national security official specializing in European and Russian affairs, and she was an impeachment witness against Donald Trump in 2019. She spoke with Walter Isaacson about the impact of Biden's remarks and how Putin is likely to react.
Thank you, Christian. And Dr. Fiona Hill, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Walter. Thank you.
Biden, in his powerful speech this weekend, ended with what seemed like a bit of an ad-libbed line, but one that seemed to have a kernel of truth to it, which is, good Lord, this guy cannot remain in power. Do you think that was a mistake for him to say it, or was that a morally clarifying statement that will guide us?
Well, I mean, to be honest, obviously, what he said there was what's on an awful lot of people's minds. I mean, it's a question that people keep asking. From the perspective of trying to deal with this conflict right now and trying to get Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin to pull back and halt the hostilities, I think it was actually a pretty risky thing to say. Because Vladimir Putin obviously is pretty paranoid that the United States is out to get him. He's been convinced for years, in fact, that we've had him in our crosshairs, that we've been in the business of regime change. And if he indeed believes, you know, contrary to what the White House has said since then, that that was meant in a broader sense in terms of the ongoing war and the dominance within the region, but if he indeed believes that this means that President Biden and others want to have him ousted, then he's going to double down, because it's the last thing that he wants to happen to him.
You say he might double down, that this phrase of Biden's might cause him to go even further. Tell me what that could mean.
Well, doubling down could also mean just digging in even further, if we see what I mean. Because, you know, right now, we've seen the battlefield shifting. This hasn't been going in the way that he initially intended. I mean, there was every evidence that the Russians thought that they would be able to take over Ukraine in a matter of days, certainly not weeks, and now stretching off into months. He may be then just digging down for a much longer conflict, a long grind, to actually inflict as much devastation as he possibly can to Ukraine, to teach them a lesson and us a lesson as well. So in 2015, President Putin had the Russian military intervene in Syria. The express point of that was to make sure that Bashar al-Assad stayed in power. And now, 7 years on, Bashar al-Assad is indeed still in power. In fact, has started to go out and about in the neighborhood, meeting with other leaders. And so the point from all of this is that Putin is pretty determined as well to make sure that he is still in power. So we can say that he should go, but he will do everything that he possibly can to make sure that he can stay in place.
You've spoken about the possibility that he would use battlefield or tactical nuclear weapons. Do you think this is still a possibility? And did this past weekend speech make it slightly more of a possibility?
I don't know whether this speech made it slightly more of a possibility because, look, to be frank, irrespective of the speech, Putin has been convinced that he has to do whatever it takes to win. And he has been definitely contemplating the use of battlefield nuclear weapons, perhaps even some with a longer range. We've seen the Russian government announce that they've used the Kinjal, which is one of their missile systems that can also be nuclear powered potentially. The same with the Iskander missiles that we know that they have positioned in Belarus. We've known for some time that Putin and the military planners certainly think about the possibility of using nuclear weapons in the event where they think that the war is not going in their favor, any kind of war, that they have practiced for these contingencies, they've planned for these contingencies. We've called it escalate to de-escalate. In other words, they do something that most of the rest of us would not contemplate to get everybody else to back down. And the mere fact that they've put the forces on alert, that they've had former President Dmitry Medvedev go out and talk about these kinds of possibilities, that's intended to intimidate us and intended to make it very clear that they mean business. And so Putin is testing whether we are going to back off, in other words, to give him what he wants and to push for a negotiation on terms that he's starting to lay out.
Tell me what would happen if he used battlefield nuclear weapons. How would the West, you've been a member of the National Security Council staff, how would the West have to respond?
Well, this is going to make things extraordinarily difficult, isn't it? Look, I think what we would have to do is have a major international response as well. I mean, I think already we need to be doing some pretty serious diplomacy behind the scenes with other nuclear powers, because it's not just Western powers that are nuclear these days either, is it? I mean, we have China with a very large strategic arsenal and also building up its own stores of tactical as well as medium-range nuclear weapons. We've been trying to engage the Chinese on the nuclear front. We're supposed to have the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review this year coming up in the summer, which has already been postponed over and over again. If Putin and the Kremlin took this step, they would cross a threshold of use that hasn't been crossed, obviously, since the detonation of nuclear weapons during World War II. We've all said that was impermissible. That's been the basis of the strategic balance during the Cold War. It's been the strategic balance basis between other nuclear powers like India and Pakistan. This would literally open the proverbial Pandora's box. So what we're going to have to do is get ahead of it and keep pushing on diplomacy to make sure that it is made crystal clear to the Kremlin that this is unacceptable on a global international level, not just in the relationship and the standoff between Russia and the West that he's trying to frame.
What is the military doctrine of the U.S. if there is a use of tactical nuclear weapons in an engagement in Europe that we're involved with?
Well, we've been going backwards and forwards on our, basically strategic nuclear posture. And I'm not sure how much we have contemplated this. I mean, I would actually defer to the Pentagon and to others, to ask them for clarification for this, because I think it's very risky also to speculate. We have to make this crystal clear in official communications and back-channel communications, not just trying to telegraph it, during interviews on television, because, the Kremlin scrutinize this very closely. They jump onto every word that every commentator and other makes. They're trying to interpret themselves. And I think this is one where we have to be extraordinarily clear on a government-to-government, military-to-military, and in an international framework, rather than making speculative commentary.
In the other major news this weekend, President Zelensky gave a very interesting interview to 4 Russian journalists, which, by the way, was censored so that the Russians couldn't hear it. But he expressed a willingness for diplomacy that would have as part of its end game a neutral Ukraine. Let's start there. Does that make sense? Can he declare neutrality? And might that give an off-ramp to the Russians?
Well, it depends on how that's done. And I'm sure that he's doing this so he's trying to himself scope out the possibilities. I mean, he's going to have to be able to sell it at home as well. And it can't be neutrality that leaves Ukraine defenseless. If we look back to the 1990s, when Ukraine was neutral and Ukraine was not a member of any military alliance, it was given guarantees by the United States, the United Kingdom and Russia of its territorial integrity and sovereignty and independence in the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, when Ukraine gave up the Soviet nuclear arsenal that it had inherited. All the way along, Ukraine has in fact been neutral until relatively recently, when it made joining NATO a feature of its constitution, which can certainly be changed. The question is, what are the guarantees of Ukraine's safety and security? And that will have to be something that's hashed out. Neutrality shouldn't mean basically neutering or complete neutralization and not being able to have the possibility to defend their territory.
What we've seen is President Zelensky talking about neutrality. We've seen the Russians send signals that they're more interested now in focusing on the eastern Ukraine and not trying to take Kiev or the whole country. Can you see, as a diplomat, what the outlines of a possible solution are, and what would you propose if you were sitting there saying, okay, I've been made the negotiator, let's try something along these lines?
Well, I think it gets to the point you've just said about trying things along different lines. I think you have to be very adaptable and flexible, make sure that it's very clear what the floor is, below which you're not prepared to go. I think President Zelensky himself, by opening up the discussion about neutrality, being very kind of careful about how he's scoping it, has already set forward on one of the tracks in which the Russians have expressed a pretty clear demand, which is that Ukraine should not be in NATO. The Russians have also made it very clear that what President Putin is seeking is the recognition of the annexation of Crimea as an official part of the Russian Federation. I mean, that's something that that might also be able to be played with in some way. And what I mean by played it in a diplomatic play, figuring out different formulations there that might be able to address both the concerns of the Ukrainians about their territorial integrity and that the demand that the Russians have put on the table. And of course, it will all depend on how the Russians think that they're doing on the ground on the battlefield. There could be exactly a risk that they're deflecting attention away from other places and intend, in fact, to either continue with the level of attacks that they already are engaging in, or even step it up if we think that they're actually diverting their attention elsewhere.
Given President Biden's statement that he cannot remain in power, and clearly it's up to the Russians to figure out how to do its own regime and leadership, are there ways in Russia that you see that there could be a transition in power? Could there be a people's revolt? Could the military decide to change? Could his own ministers, we've seen a couple of them resign, decide there has to be a change in power, or is that not likely?
Well, again, look, it's very dangerous in many respects to speculate, again, because the Kremlin and others will be watching these and other kinds of commentaries. I'm wondering if they can gauge in this what our intent is. But let's say Vladimir Putin himself is supposed to have an election, a presidential election in 2024. That's 2 years from now. Of course, our assumption was, after there was an amendment to the Constitution in 2020, that Putin would probably seek at least another 6-year term that would take him out, obviously, to close to the end of this decade, and potentially another 6-year term after that, which would then have left him in power for 36 years. So basically, there is some junctures, 2024, and again in another 6 years, if Putin does in fact remain in power, where there is a presidential election that gives an opportunity for a change that could be managed in some way. There could be a successor that's designated. The group around Putin could work together to smooth something over. But 2024 has got to be looming pretty high in Putin's mind and in the minds of everybody else around him. Unless, of course, the war is still grinding on and they decide to then declare martial law. And then I think all bets are off. And some of the other scenarios that one might contemplate could possibly come into play if the situation in Russia gets dire. But let's just say this is very uncertain. This is highly fluid. And it's also a very dangerous moment for the West as well as for Russia.
You've written, co-authored a book called Mr. Putin, an operative in the Kremlin, I think is how you describe him. And you say in some way he's not ideological, that he's very much just a maneuverer and one who believes in the state, a real statist. Tell me how that plays into what he's doing.
Well, look, I think over time, it's not that he's become more ideological, but he's become much more fixed in his views. Since we finished the book, of course, quite a lot has happened since then. And what we've seen is Putin become much more obsessed with history. That was one of the factors in the book. We had a whole chapter called The History Man about how Putin interprets Russian history and starts to increasingly place himself in it. I think now Putin is thinking all about his place in history, his legacy. He sees himself in the pantheon of the Russian czars and of the great Soviet leaders, clearly on a par with Stalin, who was in power for 30 years and, of course, took some twists and turns in his time in office there. And Putin has become very much fixed on himself and the state as being fused together. And that's part of the problem that we're facing right now.
Your description of him as a history man and obsessed with history, of course, brings up the Santayana quote that those who cannot remember the past are doomed to repeat it. As a history professor, I sometimes worry there's a corollary that leaders who remember the past too well are condemned to repeat it. Do you think that that may be a problem, is that he's so obsessed with Russian history?
I think it is. It is. I think that one of the things that we really see here is that he has found it very hard to disassociate himself and the present from the past. Everything that he has said about Ukraine is basically a mishmash of historical time periods put together in one narrative that he himself has formulated, that any professional historian and Russian historian and regional historian could easily poke holes in. And he started to see himself, as I said earlier, as in many respects a kind of an embodiment of the Russian state. And the people around him have actually said on numerous occasions that there is no Russia without Vladimir Putin. So this makes the stakes extraordinarily high for all of us. How you deal with somebody who is operating in a framework where they think themselves and the state are fused together and they can't really step back from this.
Let me put this in the larger context of history. You've written a great book. I read it this weekend. I recommend it, which is There Is Nothing for You Here. And I think that refers to the economic opportunities in Russia, but also around the world, that we've gone through a period in which economic opportunities and growth have been problematic, especially for people who used to get up in the morning, play by the rules, and think they could succeed. How do you think this moment in history is being determined by big, large forces in your book?
Well, unfortunately, we were already, before we got into this war in Ukraine, or rather Vladimir Putin put us into this war in Ukraine, starting to enter another phase that I describe in the book. I mean, the starting point in the book is really the 1980s and the deindustrialization that many countries, particularly the United Kingdom and the United States, started to experience from that juncture on, and the impact that that ultimately had on socioeconomic situation, and then feeding into populist politics. As you mentioned, I did talk about what happened in Russia in the 1990s, when the country moved extraordinarily rapidly from state-based economy to a private market-based economy. Now, over time, Putin has put the state back in that economy again. And we are seeing now with the sanctions and the cutting off of Russia from the economy, a huge blow to the Russia that Putin has built up since 2000 in his period in the presidency. Russia is going to go into a very steep recession. Many of the gains that the Russian economy and the Russian population as a result made over the last 22 years, since the dislocations and the wrenching rapid deindustrialization of the 1990s are going to be lost. I fear that we're going to be in another major period of dislocation and shifts. And this is not going to be a very easy period for any of us in Europe and in the United States to manage with. There's lots of opportunity there as well, but we're going to have to pay very close attention to the people who get left behind. And in Russia itself, I think this is really going to be a return to those severe dislocations and political upheavals of the period that they thought that they'd left well behind at the end of the 1980s and in the 1990s. And we're going to have to figure out how we reintegrate Russia Our war is not with the Russian people, but the problem is how to get Vladimir Putin and the people around him in the Kremlin who decided to embark on this war to change their course.
Dr. Fiona Hill, it's always great to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Walt. It's been a privilege. Thank you.
And that, of course, is the question. How does this all end? New talks between Ukraine and Russia are set to kick off tomorrow in Istanbul. Will they produce anything? And will President Zelensky's offer of neutrality make a difference? Igor Zhovka is deputy head of Zelensky's office, and he's also his chief diplomatic advisor, and he's joining you now from here, from Ukraine. I'm not telling where you are, but thank you very much for being with us, Mr. Zhovka, again. First and foremost, I want to know whether what the president told the Russian journalists is fundamentally new, or was he just expanding on it? Because he's said in the past a few times that NATO is off the table, and he's talked a little bit about neutrality. Tell us what's in the president's mind as these new talks get underway.
Well, right, you are, Christiana. Thank you for having me. President is fixing the reality. Where do we stand vis-a-vis NATO? It's not a big secret that Ukrainians people are willing to become members of NATO, were willing and will be willing. But for the time being, we talk with the NATO leaders, we talk with NATO as an institution, and we see absolutely no eagerness, no readiness, no braveness, if you will, to accept NATO, to accept Ukraine amongst NATO members. So we do understand the reality. We understand this is not the case for the time being, but Ukraine has to think about its own guarantees. So there it comes the status of neutrality or non-block status. There are several differences between those status, but generally it's what it is about. So neutrality is possible to be discussed and to be negotiated even at the negotiation table. That's my president several times reiterated, but only together with the security guarantees, hard security guarantees we're going to obtain from the leading states like the US, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Turkey. So yes, absolutely possible. And President elaborated yesterday during his interview that is one of the strongest demands of President Putin was even before he started the war. He was somehow obsessed with, potential membership of Ukraine into NATO. So if he's obsessed now with this still, and this is his, the only prerequisite, and the main reason for him. Okay, we will be talking, but only in combination with hard security guarantees. We do not want this situation with aggression against Ukraine or any other states in Europe happen again. That's why, yes, it would be talked about during negotiations, but only in combination with hard security guarantees.
So let's just quickly turn to what you said Putin had said, and those were his demands, etc. So you're now saying, or the president and you all are saying neutrality. There's a new round of talks starting in Istanbul. At the same time, on Friday, the Russian general, Rutskoy, talked about a shifting of tactics away from the main cities and over to Donbass. Do you think this is all part of something that's coming together? How do you assess what Sergei Rutskoy said about their new aims?
I think that everything which any Russian generals or any Russian propaganda people are telling now about changing the tactics, fulfilling the stage one of the operation, so as they call it, special operation, is mere explanation for the Russian public, first of all, of the fact that Russian armed forces failed completely on the ground. They failed completely to accomplish a blitzkrieg over Ukraine or over major cities of Ukraine, Kiev, Kharkiv, Odessa, or some other cities. So now they have to explain somehow to the public that yes, this is what we originally were planning to. So we are absolutely fine. So I mean, no use to explain this narrative, but in generally, I mean, we see that they stopped the severe offensives. What they now are doing is attacking a civilian object through the air missiles, ballistic missiles, practically every night, this or that city. Only in every part of the territory. So no longer in safe place in Ukraine, neither in Western Ukraine or Central Ukraine or Southern and Eastern Bloc. So they changed the tactics now. Is it good or bad? It's bad because they haven't ended the war. So only complete ceasefire will be, absolutely satisfactory for us.
So we're looking at pictures right now of what happened in Lviv over the weekend, where a missile struck a fuel depot and there were lots of explosions and lots of fire. It was very, very dramatic. Can you just tell me what's happening around Kyiv? Because we do get some conflicting information about what's happening. Have certain towns been retaken? Is the Russian advance on Kyiv stalled? How do you assess, you know, the balance of force around Kyiv, or are we in a stalemate?
Well, the advance of Russian armed forces has been really stalled. You see that they haven't managed even to control half directions leading to Kyiv. So they managed to control some of the directions, mainly from the north part of Kyiv, but not completely all of the directions. So they haven't managed to encircle Kyiv or to besiege Kyiv altogether. And with current manpower, they will not be able to do this. Yes, really right you are. Some smaller cities in the outskirts of Kyiv were taken back by Ukrainian armed forces. We have the information that the city of Irpin is now under Ukrainian control. But again, I will be very careful here not to, you know, spread the information to the media. Sorry for this, because, you know, the situation around Kyiv is really hard. And you can see and you can hear many Russian propaganda saying, I mean, several days, like they told in the beginning, in 3 or 5 days they will capture Kyiv. Now a month passed and nothing is even closer to this. So let's not maybe spread the information, but we'll wait for result, and the result will come in a very sooner time, as you may imagine.
In the meantime, talk to me about Mariupol. I mean, it's just devastated, and the mayor there today said, we are in the hands of the occupiers today. Do you know what he actually meant? Is Mariupol still standing? Do you still control it? What did he mean by that?
Well, some part of Mariupol is really under the control of Russian armed forces. And you well know that even they started to forcefully deport people to Russia or to the Russian occupied parts of Ukraine. Forcefully they are doing this. More than 15,000 citizens of Mariupol are forcefully being taken to the Russian parts. It's mainly from the left bank of Mariupol, while the other parts are still fighted for by Ukrainian armed forces. But if you're asking me about humanitarian situations, really disasters. You know, it is the case for already more than 2 weeks, and not so many people have managed to evacuate, especially using the official corridors, which, you know, practically started to function only the last several days. Before that, people had to go by foot on their own and were picked up on the roads by our rescue teams somewhere close to some other cities. So this is absolutely disaster, and you know that every hour practically the city is bombarded. The civilian objects are bombarded. These awful things with a drama theater, the maternity hospital, they are starting to strike from the sea, etc. So yes, we need the efforts of the international community with the evacuation and with just in order the city not to be wiped out from the ground, because I mean, they practically using the tactics that was used in Aleppo. You know, it's like reminding the situation. But yes, you heard my president yesterday. He told that people are the most important target for them. Unfortunately, Ukrainian civilians, and we will fight for our people. So we are thankful to the initiative of some European leaders that will be helping to evacuate the city.
He also said, your president, you know, and you've just said that some, not just civilians, but in particular, some 2,000 children have been forcibly removed from Mariupol and taken into Russia. I've asked Russian officials about this. They categorically deny it. What proof do you have that they're being forcibly removed and taken into Russia?
Well, I cannot comment you exactly this number of 2,000 children. Definitely, some children were forcibly taken, because really, it's mainly, you know, children with women. They are target. For this forceful evacuation. But you know, let's not calculate the numbers. I mean, one child is, you know, it's already the breaking of all the humanitarian conventions, etc. So let's not speculate on the numbers. Let's talk about the policy they are doing.
Yeah. That was the proof I was asking you, not necessarily the numbers, but that they are actually taking them forcibly out to Russia.
That's true.
How do you? What's the proof? I mean, how do you know?
Well, it's a mere logic. If I take women, most women are coming with children. So absolutely, again, you can even ask. I mean, I have my own sources among the citizens of Mariupol, and they tell me, yes, from the left bank there is a forceful evacuation of Ukrainian population among the women and children.
And can I just get back to the talks, because you talked about security guarantees, that whatever Ukraine would agree to in terms of neutrality needed to be backed up by security guarantees. We just had Fiona Hill, the former national security, European and Russian affairs specialist, talking to Walter Isaacson and reminding everybody that actually for a lot of its history post the Soviet Union, Ukraine has been pretty much neutral, and indeed it gave up the Soviet inherited nuclear arsenal in 1994 in return for security guarantees by the US, UK, and Russia. And, you could argue that that didn't come through. I mean, first of all, Russia has attacked you instead of defending you, and you don't have intervention by the US and the UK, no matter the help you're getting from certain countries. How would that work out? As chief diplomatic advisor, how can you imagine getting security guarantees for this neutrality that might actually stick?
Well, definitely, we do not want another piece of paper like a Budapest Memorandum we received in 1994, and it even didn't contain the word guarantees. It used the word assurances, which is far from, guarantees. It was about some consultations to be started in case of any aggression against Ukraine is taking place. So we see that neither consultations nor assurances never worked, neither in 2014 when they started actually the aggression against Crimea and Donbass, nor in 2022 when they just started to wage an open war against Ukraine. So we need a clear binding, legally binding guarantees. So it should be a treaty or a number of treaties where you could, have absolutely clear, state of events or state of actions of our guarantors. And once again, among guarantors, we want to see the major states of the international arena, like US, UK, Germany, France, Turkey, our neighbors as well, by the way, Russia as well, definitely. But, I will give you just one example. My president keeps asking all these months of the war about no-fly zone over Ukraine. Why he should ask this if he wouldn't ask about this if that would be, well prepared before, or there will be a set of events, set of order of command, how to close the sky over Ukraine. So that is why this is one of the examples how to have these security guarantees implemented. It's one of the examples. So, but it should be clearly written in the treaty and should be clearly, supported and guaranteed by each guarantor state.
Can I ask you, we've just got 30 seconds, do you have actual hopes that the situation is sufficiently, wherever it might be, that these talks in Turkey might produce something more substantial than they have yet?
We are hoping for this round of negotiations, otherwise our delegation would not go. So, I mean, I don't like some information that, just before the negotiations, everyone is saying, like, I mean, they have failed we're destined to fail. No, we're hoping much hope. We hope that this time Russian delegation will take it really seriously, and we're hoping that this time they will achieve the result. But in the end, I mean, you have to understand, the real serious negotiation, the final negotiation, could be only on the level of presidents of Ukraine and Russia.
And yet, at the moment, the Kremlin says there's not enough has been achieved to have that meeting. So we will keep watching. Igor Zhovko, thank you so much indeed for joining us, Chief Political and Diplomatic Advisor to President Zelensky. And finally tonight, a call for unity from the Lviv Symphony Orchestra. Take a listen. So these musicians played together in a show of solidarity, and their charity performance was live streamed online. It was the very first time they'd gotten together since the war, and the concert hall is now filled with